Welcome everyone to day one of our Shake Up the System conference. We're delighted that you're here. Over the next 2 afternoons, we'll be exploring how to achieve meaningful change in society for a fair climate future. It's widely said that every journey starts with one step. Each step towards tackling the climate crisis is important. Whilst individual behaviour change is necessary, however, it won't be sufficient to get change at the scale and pace needed to deliver net zero by 2050, 2045 in Scotland, and to tackle the climate impacts that we're already experiencing. We also need to see wider social, cultural, and systems change, a transformational shift, not just in terms of what we do in our everyday lives, but also in terms of the financial, educational, and political institutions and processes that we interact with, and the companies we work with and work for and buy things from. These systems in turn, through influencing our values and attitudes, shape our individual actions and are part of the complex web in which we live. This conference will explore how to bring change at these different levels together and maximise positive feedback loops to get the step change required in this decisive decade for the climate. There have been many events focused on technological change, technological systems, for example, how energy networks and systems need to adapt to cope with renewables. This conference is different. We'll be looking at the social aspects of systems change, what we might call the social scaffolding required to support a fair transition to a low carbon world. We all know that the impacts of climate change are not being felt equally across the globe and within the UK. A fair climate future considers the intersections between climate justice and social justice, and what this means in terms of ensuring no one is left behind in the transition to net zero, supporting people into green jobs, and giving people and communities a voice and a say in the transition. This conference will focus specifically on UK action, whilst recognising that the UK also needs to play a global leadership role. I'm Sharon Darcy, and I'm the Director of Sustainability First. For those of you that don't know us, we're a think tank and a charity that develops practical proposals that promote environmental, social, and economic well-being, with a particular focus on essential services such as energy, water, and communications. Throughout this year, we've been working with COP26 principal partner National Grid, exploring what a fair climate future looks like. We'd like to thank the National Grid team for their support and look forward to continuing to work together for substantive change. We've held a series of Together for a Fair Climate Future online events which have discussed issues such as what do we value in society, how we can live more sustainably, the unequal impacts of climate change, and what leadership looks like in this space. We've carried out educational outreach activities with primary schools, and we've held an art and writing prize competition to get creative ideas about how to address these issues. This conference builds on this programme of work. As you can see from this slide that we're now putting up, we've got a fantastic agenda today. We'll be learning from each other in terms of how to address some of the challenges around systems change. For example, how do we cope with complexity? What do we do when there are limitations on evidence? How to make decisions in ambiguity when it isn't clear who should lead on what? We'll learn what systems change is, how to get the different levers of change to pull in the same direction, and crucially, the practical steps we can all take to turn talk into action and make systems change a reality. This conference is not an end. In many ways, it's a beginning. We'll share the raw outputs of the conference as soon as possible and put them on the Sustainability First website. And we'll share them in a series of briefings in the run-up to COP26 and beyond. These will help also shape our ongoing work and help to build the collective momentum we all need for transformative change. We hope that the conference findings will also be valuable as an input into the work of the new Sustainable Futures Energy Forum that we were working with energy regulator Ofgem to set up in the new year. So a little bit of housekeeping before we all get going. To access all the conference information and materials for the breakouts, you'll need to log in via the Sustainability First website. This is the same place where you access the link to join Zoom. There's a full downloadable participant information pack with information on the conference and guidance on using Zoom. You'll have also received this over email today. You'll find everything you need for each conference session on the page entitled Conference Agenda. We'll post a link to the website in the chat now. On the website, you can also find more information on each of our speakers and your fellow attendees. The conference will consist of both panel discussions, for which will stay in this main meeting room, and interactive sessions in small breakout rooms. You'll be given guidance and information on each step. Please feel free to put any questions for the Sustainability First team in the chat, or if you're having technical difficulties, please get in touch with my colleague Janine, whose email and telephone number you should be able to find in the chat now. The panel discussions from the conference will be recorded, and we hope to make them publicly available on our YouTube channel. We ask that you please keep your microphones on mute. Please be aware that videos and names of participants may be visible, especially if you ask a question, but the interactive sessions in the breakout rooms will not be recorded. In order to experience the conference in the way we suggest that you put your Zoom on speaker view. You can do this by clicking the view button in the top right-hand corner of your screen. However, if you have an older version of Zoom, apparently, that might not be available to you. There'll be opportunities at the end of each panel to ask panelists questions. Either raise your hand and the chair will invite you to unmute and ask your question. You'll either find the raise your hand button under reactions at the bottom right hand of your screen or the bottom right hand of the participants list. To unmute, click the microphone button in the bottom left-hand corner of your Zoom screen. Alternatively, you can put your questions and comments in the chat box. Our colleague, Claire Davidson from the Sustainability First team will be able to monitor that. If you want to ask an anonymous question, just send a message to her, to Claire Davidson, with anonymous at the beginning of the question. Please do tweet and post about the event on social media using the hashtag #FlareClimateFuture. We encourage you to continue exploring the ideas and issues discussed today after the conference. If you have any resources, reports or stories that you'd like to share with others, please do put the links in the chat and we can share them on social media. So to get the best out of today and tomorrow, it's important to note we've specifically brought together a really wide range of people, a group of very diverse stakeholders, artists, activists, academics, policymakers, companies, young people, community organisations and others. We're really looking forward to hearing from each other and having interdisciplinary conversations. So please be conscious that not everybody will understand any jargon or acronyms, and please try and speak in plain English wherever you can. And to make sure that we really create a safe space and everybody feels at home, please follow the following rules. Be respectful of each other at all times, value other people's perspectives, and give everyone the space to participate and share their experiences. We're not expecting us all to agree on everything, but we need to hear, listen, and understand each other more. So thanks very much, and over to Claire for our first panel.
Thank you, Sharon. So our first panel is going to be focusing on what is systems change and how this could happen in practice. I'm joined by an excellent panel. I'm going to ask them to share their perspectives and experiences. As Sharon mentioned, if you'd like to ask questions in this session, please share some questions in the chat. My colleague Claire Davison is going to feed them in at the end of the session. So let's meet the panel. Please could you each introduce yourself and say a little bit about your work. Let's start with Anna.
Thank you. Hi, yes, I'm Anna and I run the School of Systems Change from Forum for the Future, and we build capacity of change makers of all sorts who are working on social environmental issues to use systems change and understand and deliver it for a just and regenerative future.
Thank you. And next to Rachel.
Hi, I'm Rachel Haworth from ShareAction. This is a responsible investment charity, so we seek to make the investment system a force for good for communities and the environment.
Thank you. Nazmiye?
Hi everyone, my name is Nazmiya Oskan. I am heading up Center for Energy Systems and Strategy at Cranfield University, and my research looks into energy transition through a socio-technical perspective approach.
Thank you. And Max?
Hiya, my name is Max Wakefield. I'm Director of Campaigns at Possible, which used to be called 1010. We focus on finding positive practical ways for the general public to take action on climate solutions.
Great, thank you all for joining us today. And I'm Claire Dudeney. I've been working in climate change and energy policy for the past 15 years, and I'm also an artist, and I've been leading this programme of work for Sustainability First. So Anna, could I start with you, and just maybe could you tell us what we mean by systems change in a nutshell?
Question. But I think there's two ways we can enter this. One, we talk about system change as the outcome we're seeking. We're seeking to change the system, be it the energy system or the food system or the education system. So we're sort of saying we want these systems, these subsystems, the whole economy to change. So that's one framing of systems change. But we also think of systems change as the process. We also want to create change through a process that is addressing complexity, addressing the interrelatedness, the collaboration, the leadership needed, the systemic approaches needed to create change. So there's sort of two framings we come at this. It's both the outcome we want to see, changing these big systems, but also importantly, from my perspective, using systemic approaches, using the ability to work together to create the change we also want.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to come in on what is systems change? You can put your hand up if you wanted to come in. Max, did you want to say something?
Just to follow on from the last thing that Anna said there about working together and the inevitable complexity of doing that. There are so many different stakeholders, both individual and otherwise. We're not just talking about people, but also institutions, which there are many, many different kinds. And there are so many different levels, scales, locations of action as well. So I guess I just wanted to emphasize that complexity point. And I guess it makes it interesting. And it's one of the things that we try and think about a lot here. You know, how do you actually create meaningful actions that can kind of occupy those different places and add up to something bigger and that are relevant to as many people as possible?
Thank you. Yeah, and it would be helpful maybe for us to explore a little bit what those levels might look like and how you could model those. But Nazmiye, did you want to come in on what is systems change?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to both what Anna and Max said, that when we talk about also systems, I think scales is really important in the way that it may not necessarily be, it might be more appropriate to think about systems as a region or in a particular geographical area, such that we are taking a cross-sector view. So in other words, rather than food or energy or transport, etc., as systems on their own, we are actually looking at more horizontal across all of them together in a particular geographical boundary.
That's very helpful, thank you. And Rachel, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I think just on the process side of what Anna was talking about, I think a lot about shifting narratives and changing power dynamics. So in relation to the financial system, shifting the narratives around what the financial system is for, what its function is, and changing the power dynamics in the system so that, you know, the average person's views and wider interests are taken more seriously.
That's really helpful, and I think that's something that we've looked at with some of our previous discussions is the social values that are implicit in systems and how you can start to change some of those. Do any of you have any models that you think would be helpful to share in terms of how we can visualize these complex systems and think about changing them? Max, you still got your hand up. You've probably taken it down. Go on. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a fairly well, I guess it depends what you define as complex, but we've got a fairly simple model possible that we use mainly for our own internal thinking. It's not something that we currently communicate that much externally, but when we're thinking about the kind of work we could do and trying to work out whether ideas we might have had kind of fit into our mission, we think about 3 different layers. So we've got what we call sort of the personal scale. We never call it the individual scale because there's no such thing as an individual action because people are social. So we call it the personal scale. We then have one up from that, I suppose, which we would call the social scale, and then one up from that, which is the political or the structural. And, you know, those scales can represent lots of different things in practice. You know, something at the social scale could be, you know, your friendship group, but it could also be your workplace. You might have a community that is spread around the world, you know, via the internet. That would still, for us, count as something at that social scale. I think the structural scale is usually a bit more intuitive. It's usually to do with things that governments are doing in terms of actually setting the rules. Of course, governments aren't the only structural actors, but they are pretty significant, and that's why we still you know, focus some of our work on actually trying to change the law effectively, or at least, you know, policy that's embedded. So that's how we think about it. Obviously you could make it more complex, but that sort of fits for us on a practical level.
That's really helpful.
And I'd add to that scale, the scale of the environment, that we have to recognise, especially with what's happening in climate change at the moment, that we're all within nature. So those are, I agree with what you said, Max, but we're all within nature, and actually we're changing the environment to such a degree that will also affect and disrupt what happens at those subscales as well. So we can't ignore the fact that we are, I would say that you were describing a nested sort of vision of a system there. We also talk about what are we use a lot of different frameworks to kind of get into this different complexity. Another one we use is the iceberg, to sort of think about what we see on the surface of the system above the waterline, let's say, doesn't really, we can start focusing on that for change, but when we want to think about change, we need to think about what are the deeper patterns and structures and also mental models that affect how we understand the system. So mental models of what is actually driving our climate emergency at the moment. You know, is it models of capitalism and growth that then affect the structures we create in our economy or our places that then create the outcomes above the surface? So there are lots of different models that you can use to kind of help you work with that complexity to kind of get your way into the issue.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And as you were sort of saying about the processes, I mean, it's also interesting to think about what connects those different levels that you're talking about, from the personal, social, political, environmental, and what sort of flows happen between those systems. We've had a question from the audience, which is it down to the different components in a region to interconnect, or is it the responsibility of a coordinating entity such as a local council, and is one more effective than others? Does anyone want to come in on that one?
I think that's really interesting question, and I guess it depends on how we define systems change, but nonetheless the role of actors and the agency and the processes involved in coordinating or lack of coordination, and I think will be really key in terms of outcomes that might be achieved. So I don't have a definitive answer to say, oh, in this instance, local authority is better placed than in another case where a company is better placed. But I think what we know that with climate change, it's a social, it's a margin, there's an externality, and that it's the distribution of costs and benefits, because they are not equally distributed and they won't be equally distributed. It's about understanding and developing mechanisms so that at least we mitigate as much as it can be, and so that all the actors have the buy-in and progressing towards the same goal.
That's very helpful, and we've heard from one of our speakers in our discussion events that when you want to change a system, it's not just changing a part of it, it's changing the whole goal of the system. And so how could we go about doing something like that, and what can, you said, Max, not individuals, but what can people do to help change wider systems? Yeah,
it's such an interesting question, and I suppose actually Anna's comment after my previous answer was quite a useful reflection for me, because it made me think about how, when I talk about systems, really what I'm thinking about is systems of action. And so I think it was interesting to think about, nature is ultimately being the biggest scale that everything sits within, because my job is to get people to do stuff effectively. I don't consider nature as a target audience, but it's up there, and that's just, I just wanted to reflect that was kind of an interesting reflection for me. In terms of, therefore, like talking about how do we get people to do stuff, this is where like the interaction between the scales is so fascinating, because I think it's quite easy, or quite conventional in some ways, to think about really only one particular scale being where the real change happens. So some people think that it's all about individuals buying the right things. It's all about consumer behavior. That's the only way you change anything. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have kind of one solution revolution, and sometimes the bit in the middle can be evacuated, or any kind of sense of interrelation between those two ends of the spectrum can be obfuscated. And that's something that we really try very hard not to do, and actually see a lot of our work as kind of trying to undo, because I think it has been embedded to a certain extent, and both of those ways of thinking are really disempowering, because either you've got to start world revolution, which is out of scope for most of us, or you do have to think of yourself really just as an individual, which just isn't that empowering a frame. So I'm always about joining these things up, and how to do that. Well, you give people meaningful actions, and that can be, like I said, at a personal level, but not framed as something you're just doing on your own. The fact that I can do something under my own volition doesn't mean that I'm the only person who's going to do it. And in fact, the fact that I do it probably makes it more likely that someone else does. So as a really simple example of this, some recent research found that for people who know someone who has recently given up flying, or maybe reduced the number of flights they take due to climate concerns, that person is twice as likely to do that themselves as compared to someone who doesn't know anyone who's done that. So the ripple effect of just simply doing something under your own steam is significant. And that's actually really easy not to pick up on as an individual, because, why would you necessarily get that feedback? So giving people meaningful actions they can take in their own lives is actually really important. And it filters through peer groups, and it ultimately does filter upwards, in forms of, market intelligence, for example, to companies that then go and change their business practices. So giving people actions at the personal level, creating social options for people. So we're going to do, this is quite conventional in many ways, but we're about to run a series of tree planting events this autumn and spring. These are like archetypal environmental events, but it's because they work. People come together, they recognize in other people the same values or spirit that took them to that place. They do something really practical and satisfying. They come away feeling like they've done something worth doing, and it makes them more likely to take actions elsewhere in their life or encourage other people to get involved. And ditto, creating meaningful at the structural level, meaningful, well thought through proposals that people can understand the logic of, and that importantly, don't just deliver on carbon, but actually deliver at a social and economic level as well. There's no point proposing things that cut carbon but do so in a way that makes society less equal or pushes people into hardship. And so baking in that kind of collective mindset to proposals that you ask people to basically then lend their voice to, I think is absolutely crucial. And if you can set up actions at each of those different scales at the same time and set them running, and you have people taking action at the same time across them, then you get a much accelerated effect across all three. So that's how we approach thinking about scales in terms of actually doing stuff about it.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And Rachel, I wondered if you could come in. I know that ShareAction has kind of been developing some tools for making systems change. Could you share a little bit about what you've been doing in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. And from the kind of people perspective, I'm trying to avoid saying individuals now because I think that's a really good point. For one example that comes to mind is in May this year, HSBC shareholders backed a resolution committing the company to phase out finance for the coal industry. And that was tabled by the HSBC board after it came under pressure from a separate shareholder resolution that we helped to convene. And you have to get a minimum of 100 shareholders to co-file a resolution. That's one of the requirements for filing. And 120 of the shareholders who helped to co-file were individuals who'd bought a single share in HSBC. So their involvement was absolutely necessary to create that change. It would be really, really difficult to get 100 institutional shareholders together. So, you know, I think from that perspective, there's the element of collaboration and, you know, people coming together and having, you know, numbers. It's quite complicated to file a resolution. So we're also looking at working with the government to try and, you know, look at how the rules of filing resolutions could be made easier and how those kinds of requirements could be reduced to a level which makes it simpler for people, but yeah, in general, I think we hope this will have a ripple effect, and I think there's that element of collaboration that can be really powerful in creating change.
That's really helpful, thank you. And I wondered, Nazmiye, when Max was talking about sort of what individuals can do in behaviour change, I was thinking that a lot of the focus in the energy sector has been on sort of individuals changing their behaviours, reducing their energy use, insulating their homes. But actually, there's a lot of wider things that need to happen in terms of the energy system. And I wondered if you've got any examples of what systems change might look like from your perspective in the work you've been doing.
Thank you, Claire. I think you're definitely right. Obviously, when you talk about energy systems, if we look at solar panels, for example, we know that incentives can indeed play a role and that they can create a change in the system. But I think even though that's market-based mechanism and where the benefits might be clearer, there are other technologies that we are, or the public might be less familiar with. So one such example is hydrogen, where we are undertaking some research. And what we are seeing is that, first of all, when we talk about hydrogen, even though there's agreement that hydrogen can play a role for decarbonization of industry as well as heavy good vehicles, and I think increasingly there is also interest for a role of hydrogen in aviation, decarbonization of aviation sector. So the FD has just launched zero emission flight infrastructure program, for example. So, but all of them are taking place in silos rather than recognizing that, okay, if we are thinking of hydrogen, how we are going to produce it, what are the characteristics, where are the airports or where are the ports or where is the industrial clusters are located so that it can be produced, distributed and delivered in a low cost manner to different stakeholders. So I don't think we are doing enough of that in terms of that cross-sector view. And I think secondly, also looking at from a domestic perspective, we know that it is quite complex in the sense that hydrogen, obviously there are lots of connotations around hydrogen in terms of health and safety or flammability, etc., etc. But nonetheless, again, there will be other practical challenges also around in terms of disruption to maybe not being able to use your gas network or not being able to use your hub maybe for a few days, and the fact that the way energy industry is governed in terms of different stakeholders. We have the suppliers, we have gas network operator who has no idea about, and then we have the consumers. And so as a consumer, knowing who is doing what, how it is going to be coordinate different activities of stakeholders, who is going to coordinate it. So if, for example, a town is becoming a hydrogen town, does that mean the gas network operator needs to communicate with all the stakeholders, or is it the suppliers who is going to notify all their customers that, oh, tomorrow you're not going to have for 3 hours, you're not going to have access to gas because we are switching to hydrogen, for example. I think there are lots of practicalities around role of different actors. And I think the point that Rachel was raising about collaboration, or whether can we call it coordination in terms of role and responsibilities of different actors, and where does the value lie, whether it's economic value or whether it's environmental value in terms of being able to reduce your emissions and doing something good for the environment, and altruistic value. So there are lots of different spectrum of values are out there, but we are not doing enough in terms of utilizing those values and developing them into a proposition for consumers or for households to see the benefit of why we need to switch to hydrogen. Why is it that we need to buy a different appliance, even though I'm perfectly happy with my boiler, for example? I think those are the two aspects that I would like to highlight in that sense.
That's very helpful, thank you. And we've also had some questions in the chat which kind of link into this issue around how we get kind of cross-sectoral, cross-departmental action to break down silos. So from Chris Rapley, we've got a question about just the expressing the amount of complexity increases with the number of entities within it, and that's why you tend to get these sorts of silos in terms of government departments. And so does anyone have any feedback on how to overcome these barriers and have kind of coherency across systems rather than top-down approaches? Anna, did you want to come in on that one?
That's a lot of the work that we do, is we bring together coalitions and collaborations of different actors. So one, going back to that question about what's the role of different actors, it's really knowing where their position is in the system and knowing what lever they have at their disposal, what resources and power they have. But then also we do a lot of systems mapping, but also kind of understanding how those intersect. So some of the systems work and systems maps we do isn't just to kind of create a nice artifact, it's actually to help a lot of actors understand how they relate to each other, how they don't just see themselves as silos, so they know that the action they take on their areas can actually affect change in alignment with others in other areas. So we run something, for example, called the Protein Challenge, where we have big corporates, small organizations. We work with policymakers, we work with NGOs, and really getting them all to have the conversation about what would it really take to change this kind of system. And you can also, like was mentioned earlier, about you can do it at a place level, you can do it at a subsystem level, but it's really about, I guess that's the bread and butter of our work, is really trying to understand how you get actors to both understand their position and to, it's not necessary to collaborate, but to understand how what they are doing will also affect change where other people are doing things.
Thank you. And then we have had another question as well, which is about how does systems change framework work in developing countries where multinational companies, especially extractive industries, don't respect the environmental rules and regulations of those companies? Does anyone want to come in on that question? Yeah, Rachel, thanks.
Yeah, so this is something I was thinking about a bit recently, because I was looking at research from the Side Business School talking about the kind of different focus areas of different actors and systems. So things like civil society tackling ignored issues by leveraging and exposing contradictions. And one of the points that they made was that companies tend to be tackling unmet needs by searching for efficiencies. And I think there's a question there as to whose unmet needs companies are trying to meet and over what time horizon. So, I think a lot of what a lot of civil society is doing, for example, is how to look at shifting that focus and make sure that we are meeting everyone's needs and staying within planetary boundaries, as opposed to meeting the needs of perhaps wealthier people in the world who already have their needs met to a great extent. And one of the things that we've been talking about recently in terms of the just transition is making human rights and environmental due diligence mandatory for companies, i.e. legally requiring companies to identify, prevent, mitigate and account for human rights violations and environmental damage. And this is really important as well when it comes to the climate crisis, because there was some research recently which found that 40% of UK solar farms are sourced from companies implicated in forced labour. So yeah, I completely agree with Maxwell's question. It's incredibly important to look at how multinational companies are working within developing countries in terms of respecting the rules and peoples in that country, and essentially we need those kinds of uses to be made public, and we need people or the companies that are responsible for them to take responsibility. And I think kind of bringing new data into the system, like human rights due diligence, we've made other recommendations around social dialogue practices, so formal processes of negotiation, consultation, information exchange with workers, communities and consumers who are affected by company decision making. Again, shifting the balance of power in the system so the people most affected by those decisions have a voice in how they have them.
That's really helpful, thank you. And we've only got a few minutes left, but we're going to be moving on to an activity that looks at what systems change might look like in terms of the climate crisis and fairness in society. Does anyone want to come in on what this, what their actions or what they think we need to do in terms of changing the system in the context of climate change?
I guess just going back to what I said about the iceberg model, I think we have to really understand what the deep structural issues are, because I think we can get caught up in the domains of eat less, fly less, but actually looking at what are the kind of under the surface issues of structural governance, structural economic systems, what are the mental models that are driving that extractive nature of what we're doing. So for me, it's a lot about, when we talk about system changes, talking about how we change the structure of the system, how are we changing the way that we're operating, and how are those different cultural, political, social and kind of economic factors all coming together for change. So, and I guess there's something in that, which is, what are you putting at the heart of this? Like, how is justice critical to this? Like, how is distribution and fairness, distribution resources part of that? And also, I guess, a lot of what we've been talking about is talking about beyond sustainability, that we actually, with the climate crisis, we're kind of past the ability to just sustain ourselves. We actually have to regenerate. We have to really look at repairing and creating more resilience and regenerating our systems as well, which is critical, not just to sustain our ability, because we're kind of we're overpassing quite a lot of the tipping points in the next decade as well.
Does anyone want to come in before we close? Well, thank you so much for a really fantastic introductory discussion today. It's been, really fascinating to hear your views and of how we make systems change happen, that there's different ways that we can approach it, and actually it's helpful to approach it in many different ways, thinking about the outcomes we want to achieve, the processes, the underlying deep structures that underpin our systems, and then thinking about the values that that sort of run through our systems, and are those the right values, and are those meeting the needs of all people or just a particular set of people. And I think it's really important, this idea of how we can kind of break down some of those silos and help actors to understand their relationships to each other within a system. So we're going to now go on to an activity so that some of the delegates of the conference can start to meet each other. And Alice is going to guide us through the next session. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you'll stay and meet with some of the other delegates in the next session.